Welcome to American Pulse. Our theme this week is Egypt and its role in the Middle East. We're coming to you from Princeton University, where our guest, Mr. Ambassador Daniel is now Daniel Abraham Professor of the Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton University. We're very privileged to have him on our show today. Mr. Ambassador works in Woodward Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. It's very, very important to learn so much from his experience. Mr. Ambassador was the ambassador of America to Egypt between years of 1997 and 2001, to Israel between the years of 2001 and 2005, and a great deal of Middle East experience. Welcome to our show, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. We're actually very, very privileged, and I feel very privileged to have you on our show and for our viewers to learn so much of your experience in the Middle East. And I would like to start off with your experience in Egypt, the time where you're ambassador to the U.S. in Egypt.
Well, we had actually served in Egypt even before my time as ambassador. I served in the embassy between 1979 and 1982 as a relatively junior officer. And it's there that my wife and my 3 sons and I developed this deep love and affection for Egypt, mostly for the people of Egypt. They really enter your heart and they don't leave. And so coming back 15 years later as the American ambassador was an extraordinary experience for us. It was a chance to re-engage with the country, and it was a time of relative success in Egypt. The country had just gone through a difficult period of counterterrorism, facing some internal threats. It had also gone through quite successfully a program with the International Monetary Fund that gave a tremendous impulse to economic growth and development. In fact, we helped to manage what became known as the Gore-Mubarak Economic Partnership, in which we had discussions and very deep dialogue on how to help Egypt attract foreign investment and to create jobs. So it was quite an interesting time. We were able to work on the peace process a little bit, but mostly for my wife and me personally, it was just a chance to deepen our relationship with the people of the country.
What is it in Egypt that attracts people so much? I mean, I meet so many people and they tell me there's something about Egypt. What is it?
Well, you know, the folklore says it's the water. When you drink from the water of the Nile, you're going to come back. It may create other issues as well, but
I know.
I'm not sure it's only the water.
Water is not very clean at this point.
Look, it's the people. It's the welcoming atmosphere. It's the sense of humor. It's the ability to look in the mirror and smile even when there are some issues and problems in the country. It's also a country that when and a people when there's a big task to be accomplished, there's tremendous determination to finish the task, to do it and to do it right. So, you know, you get to know people on an individual basis, people, the Egyptians working in the embassy, outside the embassy. We traveled around the country a great deal, and we just found that the diversity and the warmth of the Egyptian people were a tremendous attraction.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, what are the challenges that you faced at the time you served as an ambassador in Egypt?
The single biggest challenge in Egypt was economic. The growing population. At that time, population was over 70 million. Now it's over
90.
80 or close to 90.
Yeah, close to 90.
And all of the problems associated with economic growth, or sometimes the absence of economic growth. You have a growing youth population, but you don't have jobs that are being created fast enough. The education system found itself under tremendous strain, both in terms of numbers, but also in terms of internal reform. How do you make the transition from what used to be required in education to what is needed to move into the next century, both in terms of quality high school and college education, but also in the trades, you know, the plumbers and electricians, the people who make the infrastructure of society work. And that was by far the largest challenge that I was facing, and to which I devoted most of my attention. You know, you tend to think of ambassadors only dealing with the politics and diplomacy, but given our deep relationship with Egypt, this was of great concern to us. Would Egypt be able to manage the transition economically? And that's why, at the time, Vice President Gore became personally associated with this effort.
Talking about the deep relationship with Egypt, what happened over the past few years in the relationship from your perspective?
I think there were tremendous misunderstandings at the time of the revolution. You know, on the part of the Egyptian people, I think there was a sense that the United States was somehow engineering behind the scenes what was going on, and that was, of course, not accurate. This was a revolution carried out by the Egyptian people and largely catalyzed by the army, which pushed President Mubarak out of office. Following the revolution, I think the misunderstandings grew when the United States sought to establish relationships with these new forces within society, whether it was civil society on the one side or the Ikhwan on the other side. And that was also misunderstood, as though somehow we were voting, you know, quote unquote, voting for one party or another.
It looked like the U.S. was backing up and supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, and that's what everybody was, that was the talk in the street, and I'm afraid that had changed the image of the Americans to the normal Egyptian people. So,
well, I think that's true. I was in Egypt a couple of months after the revolution, and I heard this directly. And you know, you try to push back using logic. The United States, for 50 years, had no engagement at all with the Muslim Brotherhood. And so there was no anxiousness on the part of the United States to start such an engagement. But once the Brotherhood was allowed to play in the political arena, to contest elections, to have candidates, to join the constitutional process, the United States made a decision that we were not going to oppose it. And the fact that the U.S. didn't oppose it became identified in the minds of Egyptians with the fact that we were supporting it. And I think that's where the misunderstanding started, and then we kind of grew apart. You know, the Brotherhood ended up winning the presidential election, certified by the authorities at the time, the interim government. And the fact that the United States was ready to work with that Muslim Brotherhood-led government, I think, continued this idea that somehow we were behind them, that we were fostering their candidacy.
But I have a challenge for you, Mr. Ambassador, is that thinking of an Egyptian mind, an average Egyptian mind, even if the United States have not supported the Muslim Brotherhood, but the fact that they worked with them, and we all know that the Muslim Brotherhood goal is to have a caliphate in the Middle East, that was misinterpreted in a way that the U.S. is supporting the fact that Islam I'm sorry, I didn't mean Islam. I mean the Islamic political party using the religion to come into office were supported by the U.S.
Yeah, but imagine the following: the revolution takes place, the politics in Egypt open up, and Egypt itself allows the Muslim Brotherhood to participate in politics. The Muslim Brotherhood wins a substantial number of seats in the parliament, ultimately wins the presidency. What would the reaction in Egypt have been if the United States had opposed all of that? If we had said, no, we won't deal with the Egyptian government? The argument at that point would have been, wait a minute, we Egyptians have demonstrated our will at the ballot box, and you're not prepared to accept the outcome? So it was a very difficult situation. There was no particular love in Washington for the Muslim Brotherhood. No particular, no. And it showed over the years. When I was ambassador, for example, we had no dialogue with the Muslim Brotherhood. We agreed with the Egyptian government that their policies and their practices were outside the scope of acceptable behavior. So it wasn't as though the United States was actively or interested or had a big appetite for this. but we followed the will of the Egyptian people. And that then became misinterpreted. The fact that we were then ready to work with a government that had been voted into office became part of the problem. And it was not understood well in Washington.
So how did Washington take June 30th revolution then?
So now you come to that critical moment
Yes.
where you have a democratically elected government, you have a popular will that's now grown against the democratically elected government, and you don't have a democratic means of holding the president accountable. And the fact that Morsi had suspended the Constitution earlier on, suspended the parliament,
Yes.
meant that there was no system within the government for holding Morsi accountable. And then you have this question, well, what are you going to do? Do you count a couple of million people on the street as legitimate action to bring down a democratically elected
35
government?
million.
Well, whatever the number was,
Yes.
it was somewhere between 1 and 90. You
Yes,
know? So
yes.
we don't know exactly, but it was a very large number. Does that count, or does the fact that the president holds an elected office count? And the United States was caught on the horns of a very serious dilemma.
Yeah.
Because if you're going to support democracy, you have to support candidates sometimes that you don't particularly like.
Yeah, I agree. So moving on to the current situation with the June 30th and the new elected president, how is the Washington taking that in effect?
I think the relationship has begun to be repaired on both sides.
Right.
I think President el-Sisi understands that there is still a strategic bond between our two countries. I think the Obama administration clearly understands this. You can see in the public remarks of the President and the Secretary of State a very strong willingness to work with the new government and to, in a sense, start a new chapter. I made an argument in an article that I wrote a few months ago that we still should not paper over differences. We do have differences. But the fact that we're now ready to work together suggests that we can talk about those differences. Instead of shouting at each other from Cairo and Washington, long distance, we should sit down and have a real strategic dialogue and try to establish a stronger, renewed basis for the relationship, which I think can exist.
I agree with you, Mr. Ambassador, because sometimes using a third party or another form of communication rather than sitting down face to face and talking about things can cause more problems, and a lot of other miscommunication can arise from this.
Right.
Do you see a good future?
I really do. I know that during his current visit to the UN General Assembly, President el-Sisi will be meeting not just with U.S. government officials, but also with our own civil society, with academics and think tank personnel. Because I think even though he spent some time here as a student in one of our military academies, I think it's useful for the president to hear American opinion. Now, he's not going to hear everything that he likes, because there are still people here who are concerned about the crackdown against the Brotherhood and the crackdown on the protesters. And so there will be some difficult parts of that dialogue, but that's healthy. That's part of what makes for an alliance. I would also note a little bit with a little bit of wry humor that Egypt also expressed its view about what happened in Ferguson, Missouri.
Yes, I know.
So, we have views about what happens in Egypt. Egypt has views about what happens here. But let's talk about it quietly.
That came right in handy for the Egyptian government.
Let's build a relationship from quiet dialogue.
I think over the years and what we learned from the relationship between the Egyptians and the Americans, I mean, Egypt always had no problems having America, not even a sister country, a parent country. We love America. I mean, I was privileged to to get a visa to come to the United States. And by the way, that was at the time where you served in Egypt, which I thank you for that.
And thankfully we gave you
14
the visa.
years later.
Right.
Thank you. And we love America. Egyptians love Americans, and we want to have this bond, and it's too sad that we see things going down the drain. I think I agree with you 100%. I was involved in monitoring a couple of the meetings for the President Sisi, and there's definitely a healthy dialogue going on, and both parties understand the mutual benefit of having a good relationship.
And I think it's that people-to-people relationship that gives me confidence that this will work. Mm-hmm. You know, if for some reason Egyptians didn't trust Americans or Americans didn't trust Egyptians, it would be very hard for the two leaderships to talk to each other. Yeah. But the fact is that, you know, the average American, we study Egypt in grammar school. You know, in 6th grade, it's a project for almost every student in America. And therefore you want to go visit, you want to see the pyramids and the whole history of the country. And you have the phenomenon in reverse, where Egyptians want to come and visit the United States and experience. So, you know, the job then of the diplomats is to translate that popular feeling of warmth into policy. And yes, we have some differences, and that's okay, but I think we have more points of convergence to build upon: strategic, intelligence, the peace process, Egypt's economic future, jobs, education. These are areas where we have no disagreements, and those are the areas on which we can build a strong edifice for the relationship.
Once you have said that the work in the Middle East would never finish, and I know that you had written a book about the Middle East, and I would like you to teach us something about it, if possible.
Well, I've told my students here at Princeton University that the Middle East is the gift that keeps on giving, because it's lifetime employment. Just when you think you've solved something, you know, you have another crisis the next day. Since leaving government, I've actually co-authored 2 books and edited a 3rd, all of them relating to the peace process, because I left government service persuaded that we, the United States, had not done enough the right way to enhance the prospects for peace. Now, the reality is that it's the Arabs and Israelis who have to make peace. It's not our conflict. But if we are the third party, the honest broker, the outside mediator, then we have to do our job. And I was persuaded, having tried during my government service to push this, I was persuaded when I left that we could have done better. So I co-authored particularly one book called The Peace Puzzle, which was
It's a big puzzle.
Yeah, it's a very big puzzle. It's a kind of an academic book that I think is accessible to the public, that looks at the negotiations from 1989 to 2011, and it tries to draw out the lessons learned from the experience. So on the one hand, it's I think it's an objective view of what actually happened, but the real key is in our last chapter, we tried to have the reader understand some of the issues that might have been handled differently. For example, was it right for the United States to not advance its own ideas of what a settlement should look like? I've argued for years that if we're going to play in this arena, then we're allowed to have ideas. The two sides don't have to like those ideas, but they should become part of the mix. Secondly, the degree of determination on the part of a president. You know, it's one thing, President Obama, for example, appointed an envoy on his first day in office, former Senator George Mitchell. But after that, the president almost backed away, and the parties in the Middle East understood that this was not as high a priority as they thought it was. Well, if the president has decided it is a high priority, he has to show it. He has to be engaged, he has to make public statements, he has to express support for the U.S. negotiator. So there are a number of lessons that we tried to draw that hopefully would assist the next effort to make peace possible. I think until now, that book, The Peace Puzzle, as well as the other two books, are still very relevant. You know, when we ultimately sign a comprehensive peace treaty, you can throw the books away. But until that point, I think they're still useful.
I'm also aware that you were elected as an advisor for the Iraqi
The Iraq Study Group.
Study group.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what was that? What was the goal of the group, the study group?
Well, back in 2006-07, the Congress, being quite unhappy with the progress in the war in Iraq, mandated the creation of this bipartisan study group. It was chaired by former Democratic Congressman Lee Hamilton and the former Republican Secretary of State James Baker. And the idea was to create a bipartisan group that would take a hard look at American policy in Iraq and offer ideas to President Bush. In a sense, we were giving him a ladder to try to climb down from a tree. And if you look at the Iraq Study Group report, that's what we tried to do. We offered some alternative ways of dealing with Iraq. The range of opinions within our group was quite significant. Some of us argued for immediate American withdrawal, some argued for long-term American commitment, but we found a way to mediate our differences and to offer the President some options to go forward. What was interesting is when we published the results, the Bush administration immediately rejected them, but then proceeded to implement them. So it was almost the saying, you know, we don't want advice from the outside, but having gotten the advice, we're going to go do it anyway. So much
great.
of what we did was actually quite useful.
Do you think it was a mistake to go to Iraq?
I think it was a bad mistake to stay in Iraq. You know, I don't want to second guess the U.S. interest and the Allied interest in curbing what we thought was Iraq's growing capability in the area of weapons of mass destruction. Now, it turns out that some of that assessment was wrong. Not all of it, but some of it was wrong. But at the time, there was a conviction that Iraq had found a way to evade sanctions and was about to kind of burst out again and threaten neighbors. That did require some kind of action, but it didn't require 10 years of occupation. And I think the two decisions right after the initial invasion, the decision to disband the army and to disband the government because of de-Baathification, ended up fating us to 10 years of occupation. Very bad tactical decisions once we had gone in. It might have been wiser to do something, degrade part of the capability of the Iraqi army, renew the sanctions, and then pull out. And not focus so much on regime change as on regime behavior, which is really what was disturbing.
Do you think there a direct relationship or connection between us pulling out at that time and the growth of ISIL?
It's certainly a factor. I think a more significant factor in Iraq. I mean, ISIL largely grew initially in Syria. I mean, it started in Iraq and then moved to Syria and now it's come back. But I think there are also mistakes by the Maliki government in...
didn't have a good grip on...
Not just didn't have a good grip, it didn't understand the need to deal with the various constituencies within Iraq. So Maliki acted very much on behalf of the Shia community, but you had a Sunni community that had been on top during the period of Saddam Hussein and was not willing to be kept down. And so by not involving them more in the government and building bridges to that community, I think Maliki's policies contributed much more to the destabilization than almost anything else.
How is ISIL affecting us as Americans?
Well, I tend to agree with President Obama's characterization that in the immediate term, you know, ISIL is focused on establishing its presence in and controlling land, establishing a government, as it were, in areas that it occupies. But it is such a dynamic movement that the concern is what it will do to all of the neighboring countries, spillover into not just Iraq, but into Jordan, into Turkey, into Lebanon ultimately. And here there's not just a direct threat to the United States, but it's a threat to allies of the United States who, as you now see, are participating in coalition actions to stop ISIL. This is not an American operation. It may be American-led, but it reflects a will of a large number of Arab states who are concerned that ISIL is not going to be content simply with establishing a presence in the western desert of Iraq and the northeastern part of Syria, but by its very nature would want to expand.
It amazes me as an individual that in 2014 I watched videos, brutal videos of people being beheaded in any parts of the world. I mean, I have a feeling that we're a little late in intervening there, because I've seen women killed, raped, kids. I personally watched an awful video of a girl 10 years old being beheaded, and aren't we a little too late? Or
it's going to be one of the debates that we're going to have to live through. Would earlier action have helped prevent this? Part of that debate has to be the question of whether earlier action would have gained the support of Arab states. In other words, it's not just that the United States may have been too late, but maybe we all
I'm talking about the whole world.
Yeah,
I'm actually talking about the whole world.
We may have all been too late in recognizing the danger.
And the reason I'm pointing this out is that not because I want to cry over the spilled milk. I want to be prepared for the future. If God forbid something appears in that form or shape, I think we should act more actively and more in a timely manner.
Yeah, I agree with you fully. In fact, my graduate workshop this semester at Princeton is looking exactly at this issue. Okay, we are where we are, and rather than go back and try to figure out what we did wrong, let's look forward. What do we need to do differently? Not only with respect to terrorism and to instability, but also to economic affairs and political affairs and so forth. We're trying to look as much as 10 years ahead. It may be too much, but to try to learn the lessons of where we may have been asleep at the switch, and how to anticipate what comes next. And it's going to be quite challenging. These are very smart students, but we've bitten off a very large topic to try to deal with. But it'll be fun doing it.
Yeah, there's a lot of work in the Middle East, as you mentioned earlier. Right. Mr. Ambassador, you moved from being an ambassador in Egypt in 2001 to Israel, right to Israel. Two questions. First one, did this have anything to do with September 11 attack, or it would just happen at the time?
Not at all. Look, my both academic background and experience and my professional background and experience have all been focused very much on the Levant, on Egypt, Israel, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, part of the peninsula. So it was natural for the administration of the State Department at that time, this was right at the beginning of the Bush administration, to look for a professional with experience. What was interesting, and I think very beneficial, was the cross-fertilization. Having had the experience in Egypt, and then going to Israel, which, even though the two sides have a treaty, they don't know each other very well.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
So you already...
Yeah, I anticipated it. Yeah.
So why even though we have a treaty and we have a peaceful relationship on papers, but we just don't see that cooperation going on a ground level? Yeah,
it's one of the things I still don't understand. I was, at one point in Egypt, I was meeting with the editorial board of one of the major newspapers at the time. And they started asking me questions about Israel. And I said, look, you have an Israeli ambassador. Why are you asking me questions? And they said, well, we'll never invite the Israeli ambassador to have an interview. And I respectfully chastised them. I said, you know, you don't have to agree with the ambassador. Ask him tough questions, but you have him here. You have a chance to talk to him and to respond to his questions.
That's what he's there for.
But it hasn't happened. The dialogue, even at a popular level, is still very, very low level and not very serious. And I think over time, it's going to be one of the things that we all have to work on. And I've never suggested that the dialogue in any way would confer support. I know a lot of Egyptians don't like what Israel does in the occupied territories. They don't like treating the Palestinians. Yeah. And that doesn't have to change as a result of dialogue. But the dialogue will help at least understand things better. There is an Israeli viewpoint on these issues, and the Egyptians ought to be interested to know that viewpoint, even if they disagree with it, and vice versa.
Yes. It's known or felt in the Middle East that Arabs, and not necessarily Egyptians, but mainly Arabs, have a feeling that America is supporting and backing up Israel no matter what they do.
Look, I won't argue with you. There's a very strong basis of political support in this country for Israel. It's not a blank check, but there is a predisposition to understand Israel's side of the argument. You take the last war with Hamas. Americans basically identified with the idea that if somebody's shooting rockets at your home, you have the right to go and stop them.
Yeah.
Now, when you engage Americans in a deeper conversation and say, well, the reason there are people shooting rockets is because they're angry that they're under occupation, they'll understand that. But that becomes a more sophisticated argument. It's hard to make that argument in the middle of a war. So yes, the politics in this country do favor Israel. I've argued since 1979, when I first was in Egypt, that the Arabs generally, in Egypt in particular, can do a better job of public relations in this country, explaining your views and reaching out to universities and to think tanks and to the public. It takes an investment, and that's hard to do, but there are payoffs for that kind of investment.
I have at least another million questions to ask you, but I know because of your time, I would like to ask a final question. What are your advice to the Egyptians and to the current Egyptian government for the prosperous Egypt?
You know, one of the things I never did as ambassador was to offer advice to the Egyptian government. I would bring to the Egyptian government the views of the United States, and very often it was understood that there was advice built into those views. Mm-hmm. Look, I respect President el-Sisi's challenges now. First of all, it's stabilizing a situation that has been very dynamic since 2011, trying to find the point at which politics can resume without this kind of crackdown against protesters and opposition. I think President el-Sisi understands that at some point the system has to open up more than it has been open until now. And that means not just politically trying to re-engage with the opposition that has not been happy with government policy, but also economically. How do you establish an economic policy which is more fair to people, so you have a less inequality between those who are wealthy and those who are not wealthy? And while you're doing that, how do you stimulate investment and growth? I mean, these are enormous challenges in any country, and they're particularly so in a country that's been in the midst of a 3.5-year revolution. So that's not advice. It's a feeling of solidarity with a challenge that the Egyptian administration has, but it has to start moving on those challenges. It can't just sit back and try to do nothing.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your time.
My pleasure.
I really hope that the stability and ability of Egypt to get back on their feet will bring peace to the whole region and
Inshallah.
hopefully to the whole world, inshallah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.